In the beginning, the empath gives without hesitation, not because they are weak, not because they lack boundaries, but because their nature is to love deeply. They see potential where others see problems. They feel emotions more intensely. And when they care about someone, they invest fully. So when an avoidant enters their life, someone distant, guarded, emotionally inconsistent, the empath doesn't immediately walk away. Instead, they lean in. They become patient. They become understanding. They tell themselves, maybe this person has just been hurt before. And because empaths are naturally compassionate, they begin to compensate for the emotional distance they feel. When the avoidant pulls back, the empath moves closer. When communication becomes cold, the empath warms it up. When the avoidant disappears emotionally, the empath tries to bring the connection back to life. At first, it feels noble. It feels like love. The empath starts doing more reassurance, more emotional labor, more effort to keep the relationship stable. They become the one holding everything together. If the avoidant struggles to express feelings, the empath expresses enough for both of them. If the avoidant struggles with vulnerability, the empath becomes endlessly patient. And for a while, the empath believes this is what commitment looks like. But here's the psychological truth most people don't talk about. Overgiving slowly erodes the giver. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, almost invisibly. Every time the empath excuses cold behavior, a small piece of emotional energy drains away. Every time they silence their own needs to avoid conflict, they lose a little more of themselves. And because empaths are so focused on understanding others, they often ignore the signals inside themselves that something is not balanced. They keep thinking, if I just love a little better, if I'm a little more patient, if I show them they're safe, things will change. But love cannot thrive in a one-sided emotional economy. Eventually, the empath reaches a moment that psychologists sometimes call emotional exhaustion. It's not anger at first, it's clarity. A quiet realization begins to form in their mind. They start noticing the pattern. They see how often they are the one repairing the connection. They recognize how frequently their needs are postponed or minimized. And then something remarkable happens. The empath doesn't explode. They don't necessarily confront the avoidant with dramatic ultimatums. Instead, they start doing something far more powerful. They stop overgiving. The long messages become shorter. The constant reassurance disappears. The emotional chasing slows down. They stop trying to manage the avoidant's comfort at the expense of their own peace. From the outside, it might look subtle, but psychologically, it is a massive shift. Because for the first time in the relationship, the empath begins redirecting their energy back toward themselves. And here's the part avoidants rarely expect. They were used to the empath always being there, always forgiving, always understanding, always filling the emotional silence. That consistency became something they unconsciously relied on. Not because they intended to exploit it, but because it felt safe to keep receiving without fully reciprocating. So when the empath finally stops overgiving, the emotional landscape changes overnight. The warmth that once filled the space is no longer automatic. The emotional safety net quietly disappears. And in that moment, the avoidant begins to feel something they hadn't felt before. The absence of the person who gave them everything. Because the truth is simple and powerful. An empath doesn't stop loving because they run out of love. They stop overgiving the moment they realize their love is no longer being valued. Once the empath stops overgiving, something subtle but powerful begins to unfold on the other side of the relationship. The avoidant starts experiencing something they rarely allow themselves to feel: loss of emotional safety. Now, this might sound strange at first. Most people assume avoidants don't want emotional closeness. They appear distant. They guard their independence. They pull away when things get too intimate. So the natural conclusion is that they don't really need emotional connection. But psychologically, that's not entirely accurate. Avoidants do crave connection. They crave safety. They crave understanding just like anyone else. The difference is that their nervous system learned, often very early in life, that closeness can also mean pressure, expectation, or loss of control. So instead of rejecting connection completely, they learn to keep it at a distance where it feels manageable. And this is where the empath unknowingly plays a powerful role. The empath becomes the emotional stabilizer in the relationship. They're the one who keeps conversations going when silence appears. They're the one who reassures when tension rises. They're the one who interprets the avoidant silence as they just need space rather than they don't care. Over time, the empath creates an emotional environment that feels incredibly safe for the avoidant. But here's the paradox. The avoidant often doesn't consciously recognize this safety while it's happening. Because it's so consistent, so patient, and so forgiving, it becomes almost invisible. Like air in a room. You don't notice it until it's gone. And when the empath stops overgiving, that emotional atmosphere changes immediately. The avoidant might not understand it right away. At first, it shows up as confusion. Messages feel different. Conversations feel shorter. The emotional warmth that used to fill the space doesn't appear automatically anymore. Something feels off. And this is where the psychological shift begins. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant starts feeling the absence of emotional cushioning. The empath was quietly absorbing tension, smoothing misunderstandings, and carrying much of the emotional weight of the relationship. Without realizing it, the avoidant had grown accustomed to that support. Now that it's gone, the silence feels heavier, the space feels colder, and the avoidant begins experiencing something they often work very hard to avoid: emotional awareness. Thoughts start surfacing. Questions begin forming. Why do things feel different? Why aren't they reaching out like they used to? Did something change? What's fascinating here is that this is often the moment when the avoidant starts thinking about the empath more than they did before. Not because the empath is trying harder, but because the empath stopped trying. Human psychology works in interesting ways. We tend to notice value most clearly when it's removed. The warmth that once felt constant suddenly becomes meaningful once it's no longer guaranteed. And for the avoidant, this realization can create an unfamiliar internal tension. Part of them wants to restore the comfort that used to exist, but another part of them, the protective side that fears vulnerability, still resists moving too close. So they sit in that conflict. They begin replaying moments from the relationship, conversations, acts of patience, times when the empath showed understanding they didn't fully acknowledge at the time. The emotional safety they once took for granted becomes visible in hindsight. And here's the deeper philosophical truth behind all of this. Safety in relationships isn't just about someone staying. It's about someone choosing to care consistently. When that care disappears, the emotional structure of the relationship changes completely. Because the moment the empath withdraws their emotional safety net, the avoidant is left facing something they can no longer ignore. The realization that the one person who made closeness feel safe might not always be there. And as this shift continues, something even more transformative begins to happen. Not in the avoidant, but in the empath. Because when an empath finally stops overgiving, when they stop chasing connection and trying to hold the relationship together alone, a space opens up. And in that space, they begin rediscovering something that may have been quietly fading during the relationship: their own emotional independence. At first, this shift doesn't look dramatic. There's no sudden declaration, no loud announcement that everything has changed. Instead, it begins internally. The empath starts redirecting their attention. Instead of constantly analyzing the avoidance behavior, why are they distant? Did I say something wrong? What can I do differently? They start asking a different set of questions. What do I actually need? What have I been ignoring about myself? What would it look like if I gave this same care back to my own life? And this is where a profound psychological transformation begins. Empaths are incredibly skilled at understanding others. They can read emotional signals, sense tension in a room, and intuit what someone might be feeling even when it isn't spoken out loud. But that same sensitivity often leads them to prioritize everyone else's inner world before their own. So when the empath finally turns that awareness inward, something powerful happens. They start noticing how much energy they were investing into trying to make the relationship work. They see how often they adjusted their behavior to maintain harmony. They recognize how many times they postponed their own emotional needs in order to keep the connection alive. And instead of feeling bitterness, what often emerges is clarity. They begin rebuilding their relationship with themselves. They reconnect with interests they may have neglected. They spend more time with friends who energize them. They invest in personal growth, health, creativity, or purpose. Their life slowly starts expanding again beyond the narrow emotional focus of the relationship. This is emotional independence. And here's the fascinating part. When the empath becomes emotionally independent, their energy changes in a way that is immediately noticeable, even if nothing dramatic is said out loud. The urgency disappears. The constant need for reassurance fades. The emotional pressure that once existed in the relationship dissolves. The empath is no longer trying to extract love or validation from the avoidant. Instead, they are creating stability within themselves. Psychologically, this is one of the most attractive forms of energy a person can have. Not because it's manipulative, but because it reflects inner alignment. The empath no longer feels like someone who is asking for emotional permission to be valued. They feel like someone who already understands their worth. And avoidants, whether they consciously admit it or not, notice this shift. Why? Because emotional independence removes the dynamic that once allowed distance to exist comfortably. When the empath was constantly reaching out, the avoidant could maintain their space while still benefiting from the connection. But when the empath stands calmly in their own emotional center, the relationship dynamic changes completely. The empath is no longer orbiting around the avoidant. They are standing firmly in their own world. This creates a new psychological reality. The avoidant now has to decide whether they want to move toward the connection voluntarily rather than simply receiving it by default. And sometimes this is the moment when the avoidant begins seeing the empath differently, not as someone who will always be there no matter what, but as someone whose presence is valuable, rare, and no longer guaranteed. Because independence has a quiet power to it. It doesn't beg. It doesn't chase. It simply exists with confidence. And when an empath reaches that point, they discover a truth that changes everything. The moment you stop abandoning yourself for love is the moment you begin attracting the kind of love that no longer requires it. And once the empath has stepped back and reclaimed their emotional independence, something inevitable begins to unfold inside the avoidant. The emotional consequences that were once delayed start catching up. You see, avoidant individuals have a very particular way of managing emotional discomfort. When relationships start to feel intense, when expectations rise, when vulnerability deepens, their instinct is often to create distance. Sometimes that distance is physical, sometimes it's emotional, sometimes it's simply silence. From their perspective, distance feels like relief. It reduces pressure. It gives them room to think. It allows them to regain a sense of control over their internal world. And in many cases, while the relationship is active, this strategy works because the empath often remains present, continuing to offer connection even when the avoidant withdraws. So the avoidant never fully experiences the emotional cost of their distance in real time. But when the empath stops overgiving and begins focusing on their own life, that buffer disappears. The emotional cushion that once softened the consequences is gone. And this is when something psychologically fascinating begins to happen. Avoidants tend to process emotions later rather than sooner. While others feel the intensity of a moment immediately, avoidants often suppress or compartmentalize those feelings. They move forward, focusing on independence, work, routines, or distractions. But emotions have a way of resurfacing when the environment becomes quiet. And when the empath is no longer actively maintaining the connection, the silence becomes louder. The avoidant may begin noticing small things at first. A memory appears unexpectedly, something the empath said during a meaningful conversation, a moment of patience they showed during a difficult time, a message filled with warmth that the avoidant didn't fully appreciate when it arrived. These memories start surfacing without invitation. And with them comes a growing awareness. The avoidant begins to realize that the person they once kept at arm's length was actually providing something deeply valuable. Not pressure, not obligation, but emotional presence. Now, it's important to understand that this realization rarely arrives as a dramatic emotional breakdown. Avoidants typically don't process feelings in explosive ways. Instead, the realization builds gradually. Curiosity replaces certainty. Questions replace assumptions. They start wondering what the empath is doing now. They notice that the usual messages aren't arriving. They sense that the energy of the relationship has shifted in a way they can't fully control anymore. This creates a new internal experience for the avoidant, one they often try to avoid entirely. Reflection. They begin replaying the relationship in their mind. Not just the conflicts or the moments of pressure, but the acts of kindness, the emotional patience, the consistent presence the empath provided. And for the first time, they may recognize the depth of what was given. This recognition can bring something many avoidants struggle with: regret. Not always regret in a dramatic sense, but a subtle awareness that they may have misunderstood the value of what they had, that the distance they used as protection might have also pushed away something meaningful. Psychologically, This is the moment when suppressed emotions start integrating into conscious awareness. The avoidant is no longer simply reacting to the relationship. They are beginning to understand it. And the absence of the empath plays a powerful role in that process, because distance, when it is chosen by the empath rather than the avoidant, forces a different kind of reflection. The avoidant can no longer assume the connection will always be there waiting. They begin realizing that emotional availability is not an infinite resource. When someone gives love consistently and it isn't valued, eventually they redirect that love somewhere else. And that realization can change the entire emotional landscape, because the avoidant finally comes face to face with a truth they were once able to ignore. You rarely understand the value of someone's presence while you're busy protecting yourself from their love. And as the avoidant begins to process these emotions, memories, curiosity, maybe even regret, another shift begins to take place in the dynamic of the relationship. A reversal that for a long time would have seemed almost impossible, because during most of the relationship, the roles were predictable. The empath pursued connection. They reached out first, tried to resolve tension, tried to reopen emotional doors whenever they closed, and the avoidant, consciously or unconsciously, responded by creating space, pulling back, slowing things down. It became a rhythm. One person leaning in, the other leaning away. But when the empath stops overgiving and steps fully into their independence, that rhythm breaks. The emotional gravity of the relationship changes direction. For the first time, the empath is no longer chasing closeness. They're living their life. Their focus is no longer on repairing every moment of distance or interpreting every silence. They've redirected their attention toward growth, stability, and peace within themselves. And that calm detachment sends a signal. Sometimes subtle, sometimes unmistakable. The empath is no longer waiting. Now, this is where human psychology becomes particularly interesting, because what people resist when it's constant, they often become curious about when it's no longer available. When the empath was always reaching out, the avoidant could take that presence for granted. The connection existed without requiring them to move toward it. But when the empath stops filling the space, the silence becomes something different. It becomes noticeable. The avoidant may start checking their phone a little more often. They might reread old conversations. They may feel the impulse to send a casual message, something small, something safe, just to reopen the line of communication. Sometimes it's subtle, a simple, "Hey, how have you been?" Sometimes it's indirect, like liking a post or reacting to something online. Other times, it's more intentional, a longer message, a deeper question, an attempt to reconnect. What's happening here is a shift in emotional pursuit. The avoidant, who once relied on distance to manage closeness, begins moving slightly toward the connection, not necessarily in dramatic leaps, but in small, cautious steps. And meanwhile, the empath is no longer standing in the same place they once were. This is the crucial difference. Before, the empath's emotional state often depended on the avoidant's response. If the avoidant was distant, the empath felt anxious. If the avoidant reconnected, the empath felt relief. Their emotional stability was tied to the relationship's unpredictability. But after reclaiming their independence, that dependency weakens. The empath can receive a message without feeling the need to immediately rebuild the entire connection. They can respond calmly, or not at all, without the same sense of urgency. Their life is no longer orbiting around the relationship's fluctuations. And that creates a completely new dynamic. The avoidant begins experiencing the relationship from a different position, one where they may need to initiate connection, rather than simply receive it. For some avoidants, this realization can be deeply unsettling, because initiating closeness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is exactly what they spent so long avoiding. Yet the absence of the empath's constant presence makes the cost of distance more visible. And so, the dynamic shifts. The person who once chased is now centered. The person who once withdrew is now curious. But here's the deeper philosophical truth behind this reversal. It isn't about power or control, it's about balance. Healthy relationships require two people who are willing to move toward each other, not one person carrying the emotional weight alone. And when the empath stops chasing and begins standing firmly in their own life, the relationship reveals its true nature. Because the moment you stop pursuing someone who keeps running is the moment you discover whether they were ever willing to walk beside you. And as this entire journey unfolds, the withdrawal of overgiving, the shift in emotional safety, the rise of independence, the avoidance, delayed realization, and the reversal of the relationship dynamic, the most important transformation happens quietly within the empath. Because what began as heartbreak slowly becomes something else, wisdom. At the start of the relationship, the empath believed love meant endurance. They believed that if they were patient enough, compassionate enough, and understanding enough, they could help the avoidant feel safe enough to open up. Their philosophy of love was built on giving, forgiving, and staying. And there's nothing inherently wrong with those qualities. In fact, they are beautiful qualities. But the experience teaches the empath something deeper about the nature of love itself. They begin to realize that love is not proven by how much pain you can tolerate. Love is not measured by how long you can wait for someone to meet you halfway. And love is certainly not defined by how completely you abandon your own emotional needs for the sake of someone else's comfort. Instead, the empath begins to understand a different principle, one that is both psychological and philosophical. Real love requires reciprocity. Two people showing up, two people investing energy, two people willing to grow in the direction of each other. And this realization changes the empath in a profound way. Where they once believed it was their responsibility to hold the entire emotional structure of the relationship together, they now understand that a healthy connection must stand on two foundations, not one. They also begin to recognize their own worth in a way they may not have before. Not in an arrogant sense, but in a grounded, clear sense of self-respect. They see the patience they offered. They see the emotional safety they created. They see the loyalty they demonstrated. And instead of feeling regret for having loved deeply, they feel something else, pride in their capacity to care. Because loving deeply was never the mistake. The mistake was believing that love should only flow in one direction. As the empath continues growing, they also become more discerning. They begin recognizing emotional patterns earlier. They pay attention to consistency instead of just potential. They look for mutual effort rather than trying to earn someone's attention through greater sacrifice. This doesn't make the empath colder or less compassionate. If anything, it makes their love stronger because it's now guided by wisdom rather than hope alone. And here's the powerful paradox in all of this. The empath, who once gave everything to the avoidant, eventually becomes someone who no longer needs to prove their value through endless giving. They become someone who can love deeply while still protecting their own emotional well-being. They learn that boundaries are not walls against love. They are the structure that allows love to survive. They understand that the right relationship will never require them to shrink their needs, silence their voice, or carry the emotional weight alone. And when they meet someone capable of meeting them with the same openness, something remarkable happens. Love becomes peaceful instead of exhausting. Connection becomes mutual instead of one-sided. And the empath finally experiences what healthy intimacy actually feels like. So when you look back at the pain of loving someone who couldn't fully receive what you gave, you begin to see it differently. Not as wasted energy, but as a lesson that refined your understanding of love itself. Because in the end, the empath discovers the truth that changes everything. The greatest form of love is not losing yourself while trying to keep someone else. It's becoming the kind of person who never abandons themselves again.